Okay, let's unpack this. When you hear the word tantra, what immediately springs to mind for you? For many, it's probably, weekend workshops, maybe something a bit exotic, perhaps even just focusing on sex. It certainly fueled a pretty significant industry, right? Billions, apparently. Is that the kind of picture that pops into your head?
It often is, and the source material we're looking at today, it starts right there. With this really insightful question, an authentic tantric teacher in India asked the author.
Oh, yeah. What was that?
Basically, why do Westerners think Tantra is only about sex?
Simple question, but deep.
Exactly. It gets right to the heart of this huge misunderstanding. And our source today, well, it comes from someone who spent, get this, 22 years really immersed in the authentic tradition.
Wow, 22 years.
Yeah, studying directly with teachers in India and Nepal, often in pretty unconventional settings.
Like you mentioned, cremation grounds.
Precisely, yeah. A far cry from, the nice spa settings maybe associated with the Western idea of Tantra.
Definitely a different vibe. Okay, so the mission for this deep dive seems clear then. We're going to unpack what that authentic tradition actually involves. Figure out what's missing from that common Western sort of commercial understanding.
Right.
And basically answer that teacher's core question.
That's the plan. And the source argues pretty strongly that the authentic path includes things so crucial, so fundamental, that leaving them out completely changes what the practice even is.
So this is kind of a shortcut for you, the listener, past those misconceptions.
Yeah, to get a sense of the surprising depth that's usually hidden.
Okay. Let's dive straight into that big misconception then. The source makes a pretty bold claim, doesn't it? That the Western Tantra is basically, a powerful tradition watered down.
Yeah, diluted into something like spiritual entertainment.
And it bears little resemblance to the original thing.
Very little, according to the source. And it points out this dilution is heavily driven by, the commercial market. The focus in the West has really zeroed in almost entirely on sexuality, pulled it right out of its much richer, much more complex context.
Okay, so if that's the diluted version, what's the authentic core? The source talks about a tantric trinity.
Yes. Think of this as the integrated foundation. It's not separate pieces. It's basically three key elements working together. Sexual energy, death awareness, and spiritual transformation. In the authentic view, these aren't just connected, they're intrinsically linked.
How do they actually relate? Sexual energy, death awareness, transformation.
Okay, so sexual energy is seen as this incredibly potent primal force.
Primal.
And not just symbolically, it's viewed as a literal energetic power. Something that, if you direct it consciously, can be harnessed for spiritual growth, for transformation.
And death awareness. That sounds intense.
It is, and it's considered absolutely essential because it forces that necessary surrender of the ego. You have to face impermanence. And spiritual transformation. Well, that's understood to happen right at the intersection of harnessing that sexual energy and facing mortality.
Okay, now this is where it gets really counterintuitive for many, I think. Because the common idea is that Tantra is mainly about sex, right? Maybe better sex, maybe that's the goal.
Right, that's the perception. But the source paints a very different picture. The authentic texts, they don't really hold up sexuality as an end goal in itself. Not at all.
So what is it then?
It's described more as a powerful vehicle, a means to transcend ordinary consciousness. But, and this is crucial, only under very specific conditions, with the right preparation.
So what do the actual texts say about using this vehicle?
Well, take the Vijnana Bhairava Tantra. It's a really foundational text, highly revered. It makes this point very clearly. It says something like, at the moment of intense pleasure, a crystallization of awareness happens.
Okay.
But only if one remains conscious rather than being swept away by sensation.
So it's not about maximizing the pleasure itself, but staying aware within it.
Exactly. It's about that momentary transcendence, that flash of awareness that can happen if you're conscious. It's definitely not about techniques just for prolonged sensation.
Interesting.
And the Kalorika Tantra, another key text, really reinforces this and says something to the effect of, that which leads to bondage when performed with attachment leads to liberation when performed with awareness.
So the same act, but the awareness changes the outcome completely.
Precisely. It hinges on the state of consciousness you bring.
So less about like technique manuals and more about mastering your own awareness in these really potent moments.
You got it.
Yeah.
The source is very clear. This needs serious preparation, the right context, and a very specific intention, rooted in liberation, not just pleasure-seeking.
It's definitely not something to just dabble in lightly then.
Not according to the tradition, no.
Okay, and this leads to that crucial missing piece you mentioned.
Yeah.
The element almost totally absent from modern Western takes, that connection between sexuality and mortality. The source says they're inseparable.
In the authentic tradition, yes. Absolutely inseparable. They're seen as complementary forces. Creation and dissolution.
How does that play out?
Well, the author talks about some powerful teachings they received directly from their teachers. At cremation grounds, places like Pashupatinath in Nepal or Manikarnika Ghat in Varanasi.
Wow.
And the message was stark.
Yeah.
Sexual practices done without that grounding in death awareness, they just become another form of indulgence.
Just another way to get lost.
Exactly. Lost in sensation, deepening attachment, bondage, not liberation.
That puts a completely different spin on things. Is that where the idea of the little death of orgasm fits in? That connection?
That kind of highlights it, yeah. That momentary dissolution of self, the little death and orgasm, it offers a glimpse.
The glimpse of what?
Of the much greater dissolution of ego that liberation requires, but without directly confronting and integrating the reality of your own mortality, well, that potential doorway stays locked.
That's a profound idea. And pretty challenging.
It is.
And that explains why traditional practices were sometimes actually done in cremation grounds or used death symbols.
Right. It wasn't about being morbid or sensational. It was a deliberate technique. A powerful way to keep the awareness of impermanence, of ultimate dissolution, right there, central, even in moments of intense energy or pleasure.
To keep perspective.
Exactly. The Havajra Tantra, another key scripture, captures this beautifully. It says, the practitioner should always maintain awareness of emptiness, even in the midst of passion.
Even then.
Especially then, it continues. For just as fire purifies gold, passion practiced with awareness purifies consciousness.
Wow. Passion with awareness purifies consciousness.
Mm-hmm.
And this is also why the authentic iconography often blends sexual and death imagery. You see deities in union, but surrounded by skulls or in cremation grounds.
Precisely. It looks like a contradiction to our usual way of thinking, maybe. But it's not. It's showing these forces, creation, life, sex, death, dissolution, as integrated aspects of the same reality. They're complementary energies meant to kind of shatter our ordinary dualistic feel, to wake us up.
Okay, so it's clearly not a simple single thing. The source mentions that authentic tradition actually recognizes different levels of practice, moving beyond just the physical.
Yes, absolutely. The sources typically describe 3 main levels of engagement.
Okay, can you walk us through those levels?
Sure. So first, there's the physical practice with a partner, the literal level. This is probably what people have heard bits about, but it's crucial to get this. It's highly ritualized.
Not casual, then.
Definitely not.
Yeah.
It involves carefully selected partners, specific preparations, mantras, visualizations, breath practices.
What about our practices?
Things like pranayama, specific breathing techniques, and bandhas, which are internal energy locks, very specific techniques.
And you said this requires serious preparation.
Oh, absolutely. The source stresses it demands extensive prep, often years of preliminary work.
Years.
Things like building a strong ethical foundation, meditation practice for stability, energy management skills. And the goal, again, wasn't prolonged physical pleasure.
Right, you said momentary transcendence.
Exactly. Through heightened awareness during that ritualized act, there's even a traditional warning verse cited.
What does it say?
Something like, without proper initiation, preparation, and guidance, such practices lead not to liberation, but to deeper confusion. Pretty stark.
Yeah, that's a world away from a weekend workshop promising quick results.
Completely. Okay, so after that literal level.
What's next?
The second level is the internalized practice. This is more subtle. It's for practitioners who've developed, greater internal capacity and understanding.
So moving inward, how does that work?
It involves working directly with that same sexual energy, but internally, through things like visualizing deity unions within your own subtle body.
Ah, okay.
Cultivating that internal energy, using pranayama and bandhas again, but focus inward. And directing that potent energy up the central channel.
The Sushumna.
That's the one. The main energetic pathway seen as running through your core. The Tantraloka, a major philosophical text, actually says the external practice is for beginners. The internal practice is for those who have cultivated greater understanding.
So a clear progression. And the highest level?
That's non-dual awareness, the causal level. This is the peak view. Yeah. Here, sexuality isn't even seen as an act or an energy you manipulate anymore.
How is it seen?
As the very nature of reality itself, the sort of cosmic play of consciousness, Shiva, and energy, Shakti. Always in inherent union.
So beyond doing practices.
Right. The practitioner transcends all those dualities, life, death, pleasure, pain, male, female. They just abide in natural, non-conceptual awareness. The Spanakarika, another core text, describes it like this. When the limited self dissolves into universal consciousness, the entire world becomes an expression of divine union.
Wow, okay. From a highly ritualized physical practice needing years of prep to internalized energy work, to ultimately just seeing reality itself as divine union. It's a vast and incredibly sophisticated system.
It really is.
Which brings us back to that question. How on earth did something so deep get reduced, in the Western popular mind at least, to just spiritual sex workshops, as the source puts it?
Yeah, it's a good question. The source points to several contributing factors.
Like what?
Well, first, colonial misinterpretation. Think about British scholars encountering these texts and traditions, often through a pretty rigid Victorian moral lens.
Ah, okay. That makes sense.
They tended to fixate on and often sensationalize the sexual imagery and practices, sometimes misrepresenting them quite badly, while largely ignoring or just dismissing the complex philosophy, the ethics, the non-sexual practices that actually gave them context.
So they kind of cherry-picked the shocking bits.
In a way, yeah. Even Sir John Woodruff, who actually championed Tantra early on, noted this bias. He said the European mind often just cannot understand or misunderstands these traditions.
So cultural bias was a huge factor right from the start.
A massive one. Then factor number 2, Western sexual repression and fascination.
The pendulum swings the other way.
Kind of. Especially after the 1960s, the cultural climate here created this real market for anything that seemed exotic, maybe seemed to sanctify sex or offer sexual freedom outside the usual norms.
Right.
And some early Western teachers, perhaps understandably, tended to emphasize the aspects that were most appealing.
Right.
The promise of pleasure or liberation through sex, while, significantly downplaying the rigorous discipline needed, that crucial death awareness component, the philosophical depth.
So they highlighted what would sell, essentially.
It certainly looks that way sometimes, which leads Jordan to the third factor, the spiritual marketplace.
Commercialization.
Exactly. As various spiritual traditions came west and got commercialized, certain parts got isolated, often the parts that were easier to package and sell.
Like techniques for better sex or connection.
Precisely. Things that promised pleasure enhancement. But they were stripped entirely of their original context.
The ethics, the preliminaries.
All of it. The need for lineage guidance. These isolated bits were then marketed, often promising quick, easy results that, well, they just don't reflect the authentic path.
So despite all that dilution and misunderstanding, the authentic path is still alive. It's being preserved.
Yes, the source is clear on that. It's kept alive by traditional lineage holders, teachers, practitioners, and the author describes seeing a profoundly different approach among these traditional folks compared to what you usually see in the West.
What kinds of things stood out? What was so different?
Well, first, a really fundamental, absolute insistence on establishing a strong ethical foundation first.
Ethics first.
Yeah. Self-discipline, integrity, ethical conduct, yama and niyama in yogic terms. They aren't optional extras. They're seen as prerequisites before you even think about engaging with these powerful energies.
Why is that so important?
As one teacher put it to the author, without self-discipline and ethical behavior, sexual energy becomes a force for deeper attachment rather than liberation. It can actually be harmful.
Makes sense.
The Kulakava Tantra is even stronger. It calls people who try advanced practices like ritual union without proper grounding thieves of the tradition.
Thieves of the tradition. Wow. That's intense.
It shows how seriously they take the preparation.
And the role of death awareness. Still central for them.
Absolutely crucial. In traditional practice, meditating on death and impermanence isn't just something you do sometimes. It's often seen as a prerequisite before engaging in sexual sadhana.
Sadhana meaning dedicated practice.
Right. Dedicated spiritual discipline involving sexual energy. There's another powerful quote here. Only when you have faced your mortality directly can you use sexual energy for liberation rather than distraction.
So facing death first, helps you use sexual energy wisely.
That's the idea. The author actually describes seeing practitioners near Kedarnath up in the Himalayas, alternating between doing intense energy cultivation practices and then spending time sitting quietly with human remains nearby.
Seriously?
Yeah, seeing them as complementary practices. Integration, not separation.
Wow, okay. And finally, that balancing of masculine and feminine principles.
Yes, that's fundamental too. Authentic tantric sexuality is deeply about balance, harmonizing those dynamic energies, Shiva, the consciousness principle, and Shakti, the energy principle, both outwardly, like with a partner in specific ritual context, but maybe even more importantly, inwardly, within yourself.
Inner balance.
Right. There's a traditional teaching that sums it up. The outer union is merely a reflection of the inner union. Without inner harmony, outer practice remains empty. The inner work is key.
Okay. It's incredibly clear from the source material that authentic Tantra is this. Well, this sophisticated spiritual technology aimed at transforming our most powerful biological energy, sex and death awareness into actual vehicles for awakening, for liberation. Profound insight. It's miles away from simply seeking better orgasms or enhancing pleasure, isn't it?
It truly is. Completely different paradigm. And as the source makes so clear, accessing that deep potential, it demands proper preparation. It needs the correct context, the right intention, and often qualified guidance within an authentic lineage. It's serious internal work, not easy entertainment.
The source finishes with this really powerful verse from the Himalayan Tantra. It seems to just perfectly capture this whole perspective shift.
Yes, it's a potent one. It reads, "Through the very energies that cause bondage in the ignorant, the wise attain liberation."
So the same energy, different result based on wisdom.
Exactly. It goes on. "Through the very experiences that lead to suffering for some, the adept discovers boundless bliss." It really highlights how this tradition doesn't shy away from intensity, sexuality, mortality, but uses them skillfully as fuel for waking up.
And the author apparently explores all these themes much more deeply in their upcoming book.
That's right. It's called Through the Veil of Smoke: Tantric Wisdom from the Cremation Ground. Sounds like a deep dive in itself.
It certainly does, diving into those challenging but maybe ultimately transformative aspects. So as you, our listener, reflect on all this, maybe consider this final thought, drawn from the source, a bit provocative perhaps. What might fundamentally change for you if you started approaching your own most powerful life? Energies, your creativity, your vitality, your connection, even your awareness of your own finitude, your mortality. What if you approach them not just as ends in themselves, but as potentially sacred tools? Tools for awakening.
It definitely reframes things, doesn't it? A lot to think about.
It certainly does. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive.